Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, we welcome back Dr. Jamie Taylor. Jamie, welcome.
Thanks, Dan. Real pleasure to be back on again, and thank you.
Really excited to have you on. As always, you've got a new book out that we're going to be unpacking. My first read of that book. So excited to share this with our audience. As I mentioned, you've been on a few times now. I think this is this number 3 or number 4? I can't remember. Let's do some reintroductions here. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Jamie.
Yeah, so I always find this question a little bit tricky because I suppose I see myself as having three branches to my work, and look, the predominant element of what I do now is that I'm a coaching researcher. I'm interested in helping people to enhance their performance. And I often tell the story that, look, the reason I'm in this is because I've still got that absolute love of helping people. I absolutely got that love of standing next to somebody and helping them through enhancing their performance. Now, I think now I end up expressing that in two ways. One is as a coaching researcher, trying to support people to enhance their practice at Dublin City University through our professional doctorate program. I work as a coach developer as well. Work with grey matters, and I go and I help different organisations and different people. And then I'm a coach, and I'm coaching rugby union at Leicester Tigers Academy. And across those three things, it's effectively the same branch of work, which is I want to help people get better, and I want to help people improve their performance, and that's ultimately why I get out of bed in the morning.
Since you've started lecturing, since you've climbed into academia, and I know you've done that for some time now, I mean, you completed your doctorate a couple of years ago, have you found that that's had a real positive impact on your coaching? How has that impacted your coaching? Give us an idea on how your work in academia is impacting your coaching.
So it's funny. I hear lots of people reflecting this question often say, "Well, it hasn't really impacted much." Whereas for me, it's profoundly shaped nearly everything I do now. What it has probably done, in my opinion, is I think far more about the why I'm doing something. And ultimately, I mean, this is the journey very much with the book as well, which is lots of the work in the book is charting, I suppose, a course that I think I have walked in my own coaching practice of building various different frameworks for thinking about how I integrate different theory into my practice. Now, I suppose as an example, one of the things I think if we'd sat down 10 years ago, what I wouldn't have been as clear on as today is why I'm doing what I'm doing and trying to build the intentions for impact of my work. And I might, and I see this as I suppose, as a broader thing. Is I often see lots of coaches that will work from this is the way that I approach my coaching. Now, lots of that gets expressed in the idea that in coaching courses, people say, right, well, you need a coaching philosophy. And look, I think the work of Mark Partington and Chris Cushion has deconstructed that idea and pulled it apart for what it really is. Where it's a nice paragraph that says, here's the stone tablet from which I operate. And I'd think that probably more like 15 years ago, I would have had that idea in my back pocket, and it would have really it would have been there in the back of my head, but I'm not sure it had actually been acted on in practice. So what's changed? The predominant change, I think, is me having an idea and a focus for how I want to impact, whether that be the people I work with, the coaches I work with, or indeed the players I work with.
So, can you dive a little bit deeper for me? I'm keen to get into your book, obviously, and we're going to do that. But I want to bring this alive a little bit more for coaches in terms of being theory driven, because I know many coaches listening in, and I would imagine the vast majority of coaches listening, because they're listening in, are keen to dive a little bit deeper, are keen to have a broader knowledge base. But I know for many coaches, this idea of being theory driven can sound, let's say, a little bit frightening. Having a coach philosophy feels slightly lighter. Can you build on that for us a little bit? I mean, as a coach educator, as a coach developer, you must come across coaches when your first interaction with them sort of sparks a little bit of fear in their eye in terms of, oh, are we going to start talking theory here? Is it as scary as it sounds?
um, yes, I think it is as scary as it sounds.
I wasn't
Um,
expecting that, Jamie. Go on.
but it certainly doesn't mean we shouldn't be going there.
Okay.
And this is an area where, so if I turn up and I watch most coaches, there is an idea that coaches will carry a fundamental theory of learning.
Yep.
In my experience, it's pretty rare that most coaches are operating from a foundational theory of learning. And when they are, very often, the answers, when you dig around it, for me, tend to be more behaviorist. That is, I want to see this happening in practice. And when I see it happening, good. When I don't see it happening, correct, bad. And the more I see good, the better the session. And the more I see bad, the worse the session. And I really think that that most of the content of the book, particularly, and perhaps the learning theory for the last 50 to 70 years, for the most part, has missed a lot of coaches. Now, when we get into that, I think it's pretty fundamental that if you need to understand learning, and you need to understand the different means by which people change. I do think that that then has an impact on what your practice is. However, I'd also say that, and I'd hope that we convey this in the book, that theories are challengeable, they're fallible. That is, they should be subject to critique, they should be subject to improvement. And as we articulate here, and indeed as many of the excellent co-authors articulate, that there is no one theory that we can apply in certainly, in my opinion, in all places, that will help us explain how people change as a result of movement in sport.
Let's get on to this book. The book is entitled Sport Skill Acquisition. As I always say when we're engaging in episodes around skill acquisition as a sports psychologist, I believe I have to be heavily invested in this area to be the very best sports psychology consultant I can be. And I think that's neatly backed up by the fact there are plenty of great sports psychs who have been involved, who have co-authored this book with yourself and Dave Collins. I was really excited to see this published, and delighted and honoured to have you on, Jamie, to talk us through this book and pick out some key points from the book. But can you give us a bit of a genesis with regard to the writing of this book, Sports Skill Acquisition? Why this book and why now?
Well, if I went back to my first comment and I said, look, that for the last 15 years, I've been trying to find a consistent piece of work where I've been able to go, right, I can use this to really influence my coaching. And I would imagine that it'd be the same for many of the excellent sports psychologists who are part of the book as well. And certainly that's not to suggest that we have now done skill acquisition or even done coaching. It is just that what I hope that both myself, Dave, and the co-authors have been able to do here is pull together a book that has got some really useful ideas in it. Now, something that always interests me is that when I get asked by a coach, right, well, what book would you recommend? And I'm often left going, right, well, I'd recommend this one, this one, this one, this one, and I'd read these papers down here. And I look, there's obviously a personal taste element there, where I think there are lots of really excellent, quite pragmatic books, and we've referenced plenty of them in here. Whereas here we've brought together, I hope, some of the more difficult ideas in the domain, and particularly through a few of the middle chapters in the book, try to give coaches a framework to think about their practice and to give psychologists a frame of reference from which to think about skill acquisition.
You use this term skill acquisition. Can you define that for me? What do you mean by that for all those coaches listening in?
Well, without diving into debates about whether one can actually acquire skill or whether it's a functional adaptation under constraints, which I think is a perfectly worthy debate. And skill acquisition for me would be, and I use this term deliberately, is the acquiring of movement solutions that are functional in the context that one is in. Now, obviously, they're making sure that we're acknowledging that skill, technique are two different things, and that what we are doing is adapting to one's environment. I do think that we can, personally, I do think that we can refer to that as acquisition rather than adaptation or adaptability. But I completely see the argument that would suggest that we can't refer to it as acquisition.
You start the book introducing the reader to theories of skill acquisition. I'm assuming this is where you'd love to start here. Perhaps talk us through a little bit those underpinning theories, and pick out any key elements that you think are crucial for those theories for those listening in to understand, to know and to understand.
Well, what we try to do at the start of the book is there appear to be a series of different theories in the skill acquisition literature that are often referred to the most often. Now, this is certainly not to say that they are the only ones. And indeed, at the end of the book, we actually critique the notion that there are three theories, because there are not only three theories. And I think one of the more frustrating things that I see in the literature is this idea that there are two theories, and most often those two theories are seen as ecological dynamics versus information processing. Now, I get frustrated by that idea because, again, as we critique in the book, we refer to information processing more so as a cognitive approach, which suggests that our perception is mediated by representations. Now, what those representations are will differ depending on the different form of information processing or cognitive theory that you hold, whether those models are predictive, whether those models are not predictive, whether we're talking about a linear mode of perception, or whether we're talking about a bidirectional interaction between perception and action. But the reason I labour that point is that the idea that there are three theories or two theories, to me, just breaks down. And I think there's some really interesting work, and there's an excellent preprint for anybody that reading, and perhaps you can put this in the notes written by Andrew Wilson and colleagues, that covers the various different action-oriented theories that are out there and available. And there are really, really tight shades of grey between all of them. So when we're talking about these three theories, what we're actually saying is, look, there's predominantly, we can talk about ecological dynamics, we could talk about information processing, and for me, one of the really, really interesting, well, I don't think we can call it a new theory, it's just that sport hasn't quite caught on to it yet, which is initially predictive processing, and now I think probably most applicable to sport research is the idea of active inference, coming from Carl Friston and colleagues.
So what you're saying to me is there are actually quite a lot of theories striving to explain the acquisition of skill. In this book, you've started by introducing the reader to three. You've unpacked three predominantly. Number one, the cognitive or the information processing approach. We'll unpack that a little bit more in a second. Number two, the ecological dynamics approach. And number three, the predictive processing approach, which, as you've mentioned there, doesn't necessarily have a long history in sports research, but is slowly coming to the fore, not least because yourself and Dave are quite keen to explore this area, as am I, actually. I think it's absolutely fascinating. But if we can go back to approach one, and again, respecting the listener, thinking about this from a listener point of view, we use words, they roll off the tongue for us. Cognitive approach, information processing approach. What do we mean by that? Can you grab hold of some key areas here?
Okay, so and again, I'm really strong in acknowledging that when we say this, we don't mean one single thing, particularly when it comes to information processing and a cognitive approach, because
of course
there is such a breadth of different ideas going on here. I would say that if you would typically see it represented by ideas, and you'll hear words like mental models, schema. You might hear ideas such as linear processing, where effectively we would see perception as being a passive thing, that we will receive sense data. This will then interact with the schema or mental model that typically would be seen as something being in our head. And then we will send motor commands through our central nervous system that enable us to act in the world. I mean, there are obviously lots of different flavors of that. There are far more. There are some very interesting contemporary models, such as forward inverse models and things like that. But let's leave it at that for the time being. That has been contrasted by some really interesting ideas in ecological dynamics. Now, ecological dynamics is a blending of ecological psychology and dynamical systems theory. This idea would reject the idea of mental models. It would reject the idea of schema, and it would certainly reject the idea that movement is a result of something that happens in our head. Instead, it would suggest that we self-organize under constraints, that organisms are always faced by different constraints, and that by directly perceiving the world, we would self-organize to meet the constraints that we are faced with. Now, what it also does is it takes a broader lens. It looks at what's going on. I'll refer here to the performer rather than an organism. So what happens with the performer and the system that they are in, what influences how they move. It asks us to really critically consider not just what are the capabilities and the capacities of the individual, but what's going on around them. Now, as one of the clearest ideas, or at least the clearest ways of splitting this up for me, and I think there are some really fundamentally good ideas here that come from ecological dynamics, which is that often in the last few years, I've been to different organisations, and during my time at the English Institute of Sport, I was tasked with helping sports to develop their curricula. Now, often people would say, right, what we want to do is say, all right, at under 18, this is what they'll be able to do. At under 20, this is what they'll be able to do. This is what they'll be able to do when they reach world-class performance level. Except what that fails to acknowledge is the world around the performer changes as they move between levels. So it's outrageously difficult to be able to describe, here are the capacities of the individual and how they change, without talking about what's the challenge and how do the constraints shift around them. That to me is a really fundamentally useful idea. And actually, very often, I see it as one of the clearest examples that we can take of the differences between a passive linear approach to human functioning and one that acknowledges the world around them. However, one of the downsides of ecological dynamics is therefore that it struggles to explain how groups of individuals might work together in highly coordinated fashion without referring to what is inside of their heads, that is, their brains and central nervous system.
I'm going to try and reflect back in simplest possible terms what I'm hearing from you. The cognitive or information processing approach claims, in simple terms, in simple stripped back terms, that we have a model in our head of the world around us, of the movement that we want to enact in the world around us. And that model feeds our nervous system that then allows us to move appropriately in our environment. Compare and contrast to the ecological dynamics approach, which again, in very, very simple terms, suggests that, hey, hang on, we don't have that model inside our head. All the information is available in the world around us, and we perceive that directly, and we act accordingly. In simple, stripped back terms, have I summarized those two approaches?
I think so. I think you've done a much better job than I have, but I would still labour the idea that a cognitive approach is not one single thing. It is, and that's where I think that very often it's easier to explain ecological psychology, particularly part of ecological dynamics, because there are such clear foundational principles that are attached to the theory. And there's even a book chapter written about the commandments of ecological psychology, and that simply doesn't exist in cognitive psychology or the very many different branches of cognitive psychology that exist.
Yeah, and Jamie, we don't know what's going to happen in the next few years in terms of different flavours coming out with relation to ecological dynamics. I mean, I believe our mutual friend John Mackey, who's been on the Sports Site show, a wonderful coach from Ireland, posted a paper on X recently that I think fitted that bill. There was a sort of the different flavours of ecological dynamics, so that's probably still to come out.
Yeah, very possibly, and then we can all start wading into unbelievable shades of grey, and probably certainly from my point of view, and this is something I often say to John, which is that I would like to be a first-rate coaching and sport and skill acquisition researcher rather than a second-rate philosopher. And if we're not, certainly if I'm not careful, where we end up here is I might be able to explain the 30 or 40 different shades of grey involved between these different approaches, and I forget that my job here is helping people to move better.
Yeah, I know. Really well said. Really well said. Now, that there's a third approach here, though. Again, respecting and appreciating, as you guys mentioned in the book, there's a plethora of approaches, and there's a plethora of approaches within each approach, right? But there's a third approach that's emerged that has a strong historical context, certainly within neuroscience, to explain human behavior in our environments, and that's the predictive processing approach. So we've got the cognitive and information processing approach, the ecological dynamics approach, and now we've got this emerging predictive processing approach that doesn't have a rich history in sport, and that you're really trying to investigate and push forward as a potential area for coaches to really pay attention to. Tell us a little bit about you've done so a little bit already, but tell us a little bit more about this predictive processing approach.
Well, again, broad brushstrokes, because
Yes.
predictive processing is also not just one thing. But if I was,
and also, Jamie, just to interrupt, driven by arguably the world's greatest neuroscientist, right, Carl Friston. So there's a lot of stuff out there.
I believe Carl Friston is now the world's most cited scientist as well.
Yes.
So this is a very, very well established set of theories that populates the mainstream science. So this is so whilst this is new for sport, it's certainly not new more broadly. Now, if I was going to summarize this, predictive processing would suggest that the brain, that is brain and central nervous system, is a predictive organ, that we predict the consequences of the sense data that we are faced with, and that changes to our brain and central nervous system have as a result the ability to predict what might happen. And that rather than motor commands, that is, we send a signal through our central nervous system that indicates how that responds to sense data. Instead, what happens is that we predict what we're about to perceive. We move based on these motor predictions, and that we adjust online as a result of as sense data becomes available to us. And that this sense data, I can feel you twitching here, ready to summarize me, is that the consequences of this sense data are passed through a predictive hierarchy, and that predictive hierarchy, some of which we will not be aware of at all, but it is that prediction errors, which raise our awareness of movement to greater levels of predictive hierarchy, and that movement can therefore be understood at greater levels of abstraction. Now, I might try and just put that in English before you try and put that in English. That is, we predict stuff, and that we learn through what we are either consciously or unconsciously, and I'm using those two terms very loosely, that we learn through the conscious or unconscious response to what we see as an error. Now, this, and I've heard predictive processing referred to as a halfway house, because what we get then is this idea that we need to pay just as much attention to the internal capacities of an individual, the what's often referred to as the inner model or the generative model, as we do the external world. Now, that means that if I refer to my earlier example, in practice, I do think if we went from a practical point of view, we'd be going, right, here's my theory, and this theory could be pretty useful in explaining both the internal and the external. However, in practice, for a variety, theoretically, there are a range of reasons why we probably shouldn't refer to it as a halfway house because of the nature of directness or non-directness of perception.
So we have a model in our head. This model helps us to fashion predictions about the world around us and the world inside of us. And subsequently, we move and embody and enact in the world around us based on these predictions. If something comes along that is unusual, that sparks a prediction error, and we respond appropriately, as in potentially that's a new piece of learning. Am I somewhere close here?
Yeah, I'd absolutely say so. I think that the only bit that I might push back on a touch is this idea of in your head.
Okay.
And I'd imagine that for many people listening, that's probably the most controversial bit of what we've talked about so far, because the in our head bit suggests a very brain-centric view.
Yes.
What might be seen as brain in a jar type stuff, which might be more closely associated to the theory of predictive coding.
So where have I misunderstood that, Jamie, in terms of, because you talked about an inner model there? What did I miss here?
The inner model will mean different things to slightly different people when it comes to predictive processing, but it is a way of suggesting that we cannot separate brain and body. That the brain is the body,
Yes.
and where does our head start and stop? So we might use in our head as a shorthand for saying that the brain and central nervous system really do matter, but they are fundamentally intertwined with the body, a la embodied cognition. And so if we're taking it as the inside matters, I think that would probably be the clearest way of expressing it. Where the inside starts and stops is, I think, a technical matter that lots of people under the banner of predictive processing might argue about. For the coach, I'd be saying what is inside of us, that is brain, body, as one thing, really do matter.
And the world, the environment, comes in from the perspective of our brain and our body enacts in our world, and our world changes in accordance to that enaction.
Yes. And hence the idea of perception-action coupling, and that you cannot uncouple perception from action. That we fundamentally are always interacting with our perception of different sense data and our predictions of what's going to be happening out in the world.
You're a rugby coach. So what I'd love to do now, if possible, can you take these three theories? I'm testing you a little bit here. Take your time, Jamie. I can try to do the same from a golfing perspective, reflecting on my golf coaching from the past, distant past, that is. I'll throw my excuses in already. Could we take these three approaches and perhaps consider this from a coaching perspective, a coaching behavior, or a moment in a game, or a coaching activity that might highlight these three approaches?
Well, do you know, I think if I was going to draw really sharp lines between how somebody might coach on the basis of, or at least what it might look like, I'm not wholly convinced that you would get really sharp distinctions. And in one of the chapters in this book, and a chapter that was led by Mike Ashford, we've broken down the fact that, well, actually, there are lots of different useful theoretical concepts that we can lean on here. And I think there is and whilst I don't fully agree with this, I think that there's a very strong argument that, well, actually, regardless of what underpinning theory you're using, well, the implications for practice are reasonably similar. So, for example, we might talk about representative practice design. We might talk about high fidelity of practice. We might talk about specificity of practice. Now, those three things mean, in practice, very, very similar things, which is, well, if we want people to transfer to performance, we probably need to make practice as realistic as possible to the game or the performance, wherever you are. We might say that, look, we can probably all agree that really high volumes of very direct coaching is probably not going to support learning. However, I think there are therefore, as a consequence of that, there are shades of grey that we might draw. And this is where I am really cautious, because I often see a cognitive approach associated with, say, for example, high volumes of very direct instruction. And I am saying, and I therefore need to distinguish between direct instruction as a theory and simply just telling somebody loads of stuff. And I use that example because there are so many things in this area that mean such very, often with using exactly the same word, that mean very, very different things. So if I'm thinking about this as a rugby coach, if I'm taking a cognitive approach, I'm probably thinking about how I can change what somebody is thinking or their representation of a movement. I might be looking at methods that get them to think about and understand the movements they're engaged in. I would absolutely be getting them to think about coordinated team actions, or indeed what you refer to the idea of shared mental models, where in a team meeting before a session, we might be talking about how we're going to run a strike play. In football, we might be talking about a pressing strategy. Who are we going to press? What are our pressing triggers going to be? In another sport, you might be talking about how you're going to play the ball out. Now, and we're all going to get a shared understanding of this, and we're going to have conscious awareness of the different triggers that we might use, and then we might go and enact that on the pitch, then go and reflect on how it is working. If I was using an ecological dynamics approach, or at least if my underpinning theory happens to be ecological dynamics, I would imagine that I would probably be looking to draw on the notion of shared affordances, and I would probably not privilege the idea that having declarative or awareness of different strategies, and instead I might constrain the environment to allow behaviours to emerge, and that we might focus more on knowledge in performance rather than knowledge out of performance. Whereas if I was taking an active inference approach, well, I don't think in sport we've gotten anywhere near being able to draw a distinction. And I don't think that yet we're at a stage where we can definitively say, well, in terms of active inference or predictive processing, here are the practical implications that are wholly different to what has come before, which currently, at the time that we're sat here talking about this book, means that, well, I don't think there are really clear, distinct differences between active inference and previous theories. I just don't think that we've got that far.
Listening to what you're saying, it's interesting because as you're talking, I'm thinking about some of the previous conversations I've had with others on the Sports Psych show. I'm thinking about going back to your first comment about actually struggling to be able to differentiate which approach a coach might be taking when you say observe their coaching session, because they might look the same. I mean, Professor Chris Cushion spoke about this, the challenge of face validity. And actually, as to speak to what you've said there, you might actually not be able to, it's not obvious uh, which theory a coach is utilizing. And you bring up an example, and I think of my writing every single day, where often I use the term specificity and fidelity. I know you wrote a great research paper alongside your colleague Robin Taylor around cognitive approaches to coaching and learning, and one of the areas in that research was talking about fidelity, specificity. Nikki Hodges, Keith Lurs talk about specificity of practice in their challenge point or extended challenge point. And then that notion of representative design, which is the language that ecological dynamicists use. So basically, all three terms meaning pretty much the same thing. So there's so much crossover here, which I suppose controversial point here. But so what is the point of all of this then, Jamie? What is the point of differentiating between these? If there's a huge amount of crossover, is there any point to this?
In my opinion, yes, there is. And I think we circle back to what I said at the start, which is that what's fundamentally changed for me, and it's how do I shape my intentions for impact? Now, for me, we need to be worried less about what practice looks like. That is, I watch a session and I can go, right, tick, 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 that's good practice. Because I think that if we take the incredibly general recommendations that flow from these different theories and what overlaps, I can go, okay, so right, well, that's I can turn up and look at any session in any sport and go, oh, okay, I see that. That's generally okay. That's decent practice. But I'm not in this business, and I'm sure that not many people are, because they just want to be decent. I want to be the very best coach I can be. That means we need, in my opinion, we need to get the deeper levels of nuance, which is why here we've proposed a real focus on the idea of intentions for impact. And we've built specifically on models that were built by Dave Collins, Andy Abraham, and later Bob Muir in PJDM, where we look at, right, well, how can we really understand how we shape practices and how we shape activities specifically, because coaching goes a whole long way beyond whether you're on the pitch, court, dojo. How do we shape the way that we interact, our coaching style, and how do we shape our activity design, what performers are doing based on specific intentions? And we've bracketed the idea of intentions into a single session where we could refer to what types of fidelity are athletes experiencing, what types of real, and not just seeing, right, well, if it looks like the game, then that must be good, because there's a whole lot more going on than just what it looks like, how we feel in it, how hard we're working, the problems that we're solving. All of those things are not particularly visible. And in practice, that's meant that over time, GPS units, heart rate monitors, and there's a boatload of different technologies that help us better understand the physiology during practice, but not so much the other three elements of fidelity. And then we also want to understand how somebody's engaging with an activity. And there's a really neat idea that flows from, again, the mainstream science that has popped up a few times in the coaching literature. And I believe that Renshaw et al. In their constraints-led approach book also used a similar idea, which looked at the explore-exploit continuum. Explore-exploit are the different ways that humans interact with the world. And we can be more exploratory, seeking new information, playing around with new things, or we can be more exploitative. What we've suggested here is that if we're clear on the ways in which we want somebody to be engaging with an activity, that is, we might want people actively exploring. We might want somebody being taught and therefore deliberately expanding. We might want somebody to be reasonably good already, it's just something they're going to refine a bit. Or we might want somebody to be experiencing pretty significant pressure and feel like they've got to execute. Now, all of those different things will yield a different level of error. That is, how many errors do we want somebody to be making in practice, a la Challenge Point, a la the work of Keith Lose and Nicola Hodges. And bringing this together, we're going, right, well, if we're watching practice, let's have a really clear idea of how successful we want somebody to be, what we want them to be experiencing, and therefore be able to monitor practice accordingly. Now, that's based on those ideas there, that's a whole lot more subtle than going, right, let's just stick them in something that looks specific. And I'm not, by the way, just to be really clear, I'm not suggesting that's what any previous scholars have said. But it allows us to get to a deeper level of understanding, particularly when I'm a coach and if I've got to monitor and steer practice.
I'm going to try and reflect back what I've heard there from start to finish, and I'm probably not going to form a question, Jamie. So it would just be good to get your thoughts from what I'm saying here. When you originally started that answer, you used the abbreviation PJDM, which, for those listening in, professional judgment and decision making. We've spoken numerous times about professional judgment and decision making. Andy Abraham has been on the show. We had a show with Mike Ashford, who is a contributor to this book, and Lowell Collins, who's also a contributor to the book. So professional judgment and decision making. So, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I always, when I'm thinking about judgment and decision making, I'm thinking of coaches sitting in a room, working on their activities, working on what they feel that they need to provide for players. And you use this term intention to encapsulate that. Picture coaches in a room thinking about the intent of the upcoming session. And you've unpacked that in several ways. You've talked, and I'm sure there's multiple ways here that one can think about intent or intention. And also we might think about the context that you're coaching in. We might think about the specific players, organisation, socio-political, socio-historical, socio-environmental factors there. So we could go in real deep there, I'm sure. But when it comes to session design, you're talking about fidelity of practice, as we've mentioned. How much does it look like the game? How much does it represent the challenges the game produces on game day? You're talking about with intent. You're talking about I kind of heard the sensorial experiences of players. What do we want them to feel? What do we want them to experience? As well as what problems are we going to set them? And then you also speak about, and I wrote down, the attentional engagement of the players. What we want them to attend to. I suppose that links neatly in with the problems that we're setting them. Those are the things I heard you speak to there. Am I pretty much on the button with you there?
Yeah, so you'll notice there is a significant weighting on what are performers experiencing.
Yeah.
What sense data are they getting? And that sense data isn't just visual. It isn't just what do they see. There's haptic, how they feel, proprioceptive. There's auditory. There's all sorts of different sense data that we could be receiving and acting upon. What we've drawn attention to here is the idea of fidelity. That is, what is challenging them. Then, how are they interacting with that challenge, which is the notion of explore to exploit. Now, there's obviously a multi-theoretical basis to this, but therefore, if I wanted to use this PJDM model, I can go, how am I trying to impact people? What do I want their experience to be? And then this really nice, neat idea, I believe it's Bob Muir's idea, which is that there's two ways in which we can influence that. One is through the ways in which we interact with performers, and we frame that as coaching style.
Okay.
Some excellent work by Shane Pild in making that more applicable to sports coaching. And the other way we framed it is around activity design, which is not practice design, because I think every coach should probably recognise that practice time on the pitch, field, court is very limited when compared to the work that most reasonably high-level performers go and get into away from the pitch, court, dojo, wherever we are. Now, when we're applying theory to this, or at least the underpinning theories that we discussed earlier, I can certainly see how some people from different sports might get attracted to different theoretical forms based on the sport they're in. For example, I can see completely how notions of more direct perception would be fully applicable to, say, baseball, whereas in slower form sports, certainly like my own, which is rugby union, where there is really tight coordination needed in a team setting, whereas there are other moments in the game where we need to be acting with certainly the idea of a motor program, and the expression of a motor program seems to fit far less. Now, that means that this creates a really complex web where some of these theories seem to work really well depending on certain sporting actions, whereas they don't in other places. And we believe that you can probably use the PJDM framework with a different underpinning theory, which may shift slightly what you're seeing and how you see it, but you can still apply the model here with these different theoretical bases, or indeed a mixed theoretical model that's more practically focused than is theoretically focused.
I just want to dig a little bit deeper into that, because aware that you are heavily invested in your professional life around coach education and coach development, when you've introduced and had conversations with coaches about these underpinning theories, the information processing approach or cognitive approach, the ecological dynamics approach, and more latterly, predictive processing approach or active inference, you must have had coaches come back to you and say, oh, yeah, you know what, I hear you, but I'm not too sure that that theory would apply to my sport or this sport. It feels a bit far removed. You've mentioned the difference maybe there between rugby and baseball. Do you tend to have that kind of response from coaches?
It'd be very rare that I would dive in at the theoretical end.
Okay.
That ultimately a key role is really helping people to be able to connect the theory to practice, and the thing that most people would spend most of their time thinking about is practice.
Yeah.
Now, I'm thinking about an interaction I had with a coach the other day where we were looking at a piece of work that she had been doing, and she sent over an element of her session. And effectively, my questioning went down the route of, well, why are you going for that? In this case, it was, so why are you awarding points for that? What's going to be the impact on the players? Now that then led to a discussion of, well, we might award points because it motivates behaviour, a la behaviourism, which is the whole idea of gamification is underpinned by behaviourist idea. So then we go, okay, well, what other ways could you see this? What other ways can we go down this road? And I think that it's by going through practice to theory that we can really get into things, and we can really have an influence. Whereas if theory is something that's divorced from practice, and that is something that's seen as entirely separate, I think that the utility of these ideas is very limited. But I go back to the idea where we started, which is, yes, some of these ideas are scary. Indeed, the scope and the scope and complexity, particularly of cognitive psychology and predictive processing, is pretty scary. But it doesn't mean that there aren't some fundamentally really good ideas that can shape and improve our coaching as a result.
If I'm a coach and I'm working closely with you, and the first interaction I have with you is, Jamie, I just love, for example, I'll take ecological dynamics here. I love ecological dynamics. I love the theory. It makes so much sense to me. I really believe that's kind of how our brain functions. And I really want to utilize ecological dynamics as my underpinning theory. As you've said there, you tend to work backwards from practice to theory, but this coach says, I want to be theoretically oriented here. I'm passionate about it. I get that works for me, but I really want to hone in and become outstanding at coaching in a manner that's theoretically oriented towards ecological dynamics. Where does that leave you as somebody who seems quite passionate about this blended approach?
Well, look, in that case, my job is to support a coach's thinking, and my job is to enhance their capacity to act. So it's certainly not to say, well, here's the best way to do things, because I'd hope that if somebody was reading this book, they'd appreciate that there's a range of different strengths and weaknesses based on these underpinning theories. And that's ultimately where I see what I hope the message of this book is, that if we're going to adopt a way, or let's just understand what are the ups and downsides of that. And one of the ideas that, and let's say separate to the specific instance we're talking about here, and I mean, I'm thinking of the coaches that I've worked with, nearly none of them have arrived with a view like what you're suggesting. But I'd be saying that, look, if we understand there that, well, what is the role of theory in practice? And again, one of the ideas that we draw on here is the distinction between evidence-based and evidence-informed practice. And this is another interestingly controversial area, because people refer to evidence-based practice and evidence-informed practice and mean different things. So if I say evidence-based practice, it means that I'm weighting evidence as being the fundamental cornerstone of what I work from. Whereas evidence-informed practice, I would see it more as a bit of let's call it a jumble. And that jumble is my practical experience, my understanding of the context, the preferences of the people I'm working with, and the evidence that I might deploy against it. What I think we've probably seen a bit of a trend of in sport is theory-based practice, which is that theory comes first, and it's theory that should therefore influence all of our actions. In my opinion, I'm not sure that's the most useful way of looking at coaching. Doesn't mean that I would go and say to somebody, no, that's absolutely wrong, down your tools immediately. It's just that I'd be saying, in my opinion, I think that is somewhat limiting if we take a single theory and apply that to everything that we might see, especially given that, yes, we might talk about these three supposed consistent theories of skill acquisition, but there is a world of pedagogic literature. There's a world of sociological literature. There is a world of biopsychosocial literature out there that you could get into. And I really, really don't think that a single theoretical view is the most helpful way we can grapple with the complexity of human life.
For the last 10 minutes or so, I'd love to further bring this alive, and I'd love you to use yourself as a bit of a guinea pig here, if we may, again, knowing that you are every single day of your life, not only are you developing coaches from an educational and a coach development standpoint, so you're standing side by side with coaches, you're lecturing, you're researching, but you're coaching yourself at Leicester Tigers. So you're coaching rugby. What I've heard throughout this episode is professional judgment, decision making. I've heard the importance in that process of the intent. In essence, I'm sure you might not like this term, but being player-centered in terms of thinking about the experiences that they're having, the sensorial experiences, the attentional engagement, what you want them to focus their attention on, the fidelity of practice, coaching style, as you say, session design. You know, we've got these three, and there's more, but we've got these three theoretical approaches to skill acquisition or motor control, if you like. All of this is floating around in your head. There's a lot going on in there, Jamie. And you're sitting down with your fellow coaches, or you're sitting down on your own, you're thinking of your session design, you're thinking of your coaching style, and then you're out there and you're delivering on this. I'm going to try and formulate a question here, just in terms of, so give me an example of what's going through your mind as you are coaching, relating this to the theories. Are you in your mind thinking about the cognitive side of things, or the ecological side of things, or predictive processing? Is this crossing your mind? Is this running through your head as you're coaching? Are you adapting your sessions on the go? Are you adapting your interactions, or your interactions in your coaching style, your behaviors being influenced by these theoretical underpinnings? Yeah, just give us a sort of a landscape of what's going on in your brain and your body, in your world as you're coaching.
Well, not that. So this actually, when we looked, so the process of writing the book and the model that's built out is actually something that Mike Ashford and I built out whilst I was coaching at Wasps and he was my coach developer at Wasps. Which is, so how do we simplify this? Not simplify it. How do we enact this? And I think one of the things that I'd be really keen to emphasize is that what we probably underestimate is the influence that planning, that is deliberate thinking outside of coaching, can have on our practice. So I'm certainly not stood on the pitch going, oh, could be this, could be this, could be this, could be this. Instead, I'm going before a session, look, what intentions, how do I want to impact a player? Now that can be macro, which is really big picture. How do I want to impact this player, this group, with all the different considerations you just articulated there? what does impact look like over a shorter period of time, a block? And then what does it look like today? Now, what I will then do is go, right, so, and this is something that we're using at the moment, and I strongly encourage is a good idea. What are our intentions for impact for this session? How do we want to impact players? How do we want to impact the group based on tonight or this morning? Let's give ourselves some markers. And then, rather than spending enormous amount of time planning content, which I think that a lot of people do, I'd spend more time planning out how do I intend to impact players in this chunk of a session. Now, in rugby, there's a increasing habit towards people planning out 2-minute and 3-minute blocks, which I don't see elsewhere. But let's say I've got a block of time in a session that's 5 minutes. I'll be clear. How do I want to impact them here? And that impact will be, how do I want them to interact with it? And then what types of fidelity might I want them to experience? Then plan my content from there. That then gives me a marker during the session to go, I'm looking for some more exploratory behavior here. So I'm probably looking for a pretty low rate of success. I'm going to be watching players trying new things. If I'm not seeing that, then we're not acting in accordance with what my intentions to impact them are. So I need to change something. That then frees up my ability to think during a session and make quicker, more intuitive decisions about how I shift things. It also means at the end of the session, I can reflect back and go, what were our intentions? And this is a model that we use at the end of the book, and it's a nice model built out by Lol Collins, which is the big five. What happened? Why did you take that option? What other options could you have taken? What context could you choose to make you pick something else? And how will you know you made a good decision? It gives you a focus for the auditing and reflecting on the decisions that you've taken. And there's a nice idea, which I think really sums up what we're going for here, which is that if coaching is a form of expertise, that expertise is inherently adaptive. The adaptive skill model of expertise refers to being able to change according to one's intentions or change intentions based on changing circumstances. By planning your intentions and by using different theoretical concepts to plan out how you'll enact those intentions before a session allows you to change when you're in it. But it doesn't mean I'm sat thinking about the relative directness of perception when I've got a 5-minute block with a group of players.
Fast thinking and slow thinking. The slow thinking before to aid the fast thinking during.
Yes, absolutely.
Jamie, that's just absolutely fascinating, and I really love the way you've broken down your experience of coaching there, that idea of preparing and planning for the session as that form of slow thinking in aid of the quicker thinking that's required in the session. I really, really love that. There's so many nuggets like that throughout the book. It's definitely a text I'm going to dive into time and again that's going to aid my sports psychology consultancy. Just as a final reflection on the book, we've touched on so many bits here, but there's more in here. There's teamwork, there's mental skills, athlete management. So there's so much in here. Just some final thoughts from yourself for everybody listening in. Some final reflections on this book.
Well, look, I think that both for Dave and myself, the book is the output of an awful lot of thinking, an awful lot of research, an awful lot of reading. I would just really hope that people find it useful, and that if they were to buy it, they'd think that at the end of it, that it supports them to be a better coach. And I don't really think that I can ask a great deal more than that. I mean, it was a long journey, and it was bloody good fun to write it. And as it always is, a real pleasure to work with Dave and the other colleagues who are in the book. But I just hope that in some way, shape, or form, it helps people in their coaching practice.
Was it good fun to write it, Jamie? I write books. It's a range of emotions, surely.
Well, if you're as big a geek as me, sometimes it is.
I think I am. But I find it's a range of emotions to write books. But no, this is absolutely fantastic. And I can't thank you enough for the time you've taken to come on and share your great insights with us. So, last question, and possibly most important, how can people find you, follow you, get in contact, and purchase the book?
I think probably easiest to follow me on social media. I'm at JAT Taylor, and Dave is at Dave Grey Matters UK. I think that that's probably the easiest place to get us, and it won't be too difficult to get hold of our email addresses or any other contact.
And to get that book?
Should be available at all good booksellers. I believe it's available now on ebook, and I think the print version is should be shipping at some point next month.
All right, brilliant. Jamie, thank you so much for today.
Dan, real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I hope you did as well. As always, if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. Please do contact me through my website or through any social media. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.